Hello, my name is Olivia Miller. I am a sustainability student at the University of St. Thomas, and today I will be discussing some research regarding the conservation mismatch and biodiversity priorities within the United States. This topic and this research is extremely relevant to the state of the planet currently and the state of the planet in the future. The significance is that in addition to respecting nature's intrinsic value, conservation is a relevant concept that impacts the future of many human industries. Well-informed conservation efforts can lead the way to a healthy planet, and a thriving planet leads to a thriving humanity because of our interconnectedness with our surrounding natural ecosystems. So in essence, a healthy planet will lead to a healthy humanity beyond nature's intrinsic value. So the study that began this examination of historical conservation compared to where conservation should be was done by a man named Clinton Jenkins. His research is titled U.S. Protected Lands Mismatch Biodiversity Priorities. And so historical conservation traditionally is based off of landscapes that are beautiful or land that isn't being presently used for things such as agriculture or industry. So what Jenkins is proposing is that we look at biodiversity to determine what lands we should be conserving. Now, biodiversity is important for a number of reasons. It helps a lot with natural ecosystem resilience. And so Jenkins looked at mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and trees, and he discovered that although all those things have differing areas of high richness, he said that conservation should be guided by things such as the vulnerability of their ranges, if they are endemic or not, meaning if they are only found domestically in the United States, and the protection status and ownership of the involved lands. This is different than historical conservation, which has been based off of landscape beauty and utilization. Combining geographic biodiversity patterns with current protected area distribution was used in order to create a map to guide future protection strategies. This map is strengthened by the introduction of a priority index. This priority index helped him formulate 9 conservation priorities, which were defined as the most crucial for the United States. Now, this priority index is based off of the criteria stated before, and you can see on the right side of this slide the 9 areas that he deems the most crucial for the United States based off of those biodiversity criteria. Once Jenkins, from the previous slide, published his perspective on biodiversity-based conservation, fellow scientists either agreed or disagreed, which kind of started a debate. One example of someone who decided to take an alternative perspective is Christopher Brown. His research was titled, or his opinion article was titled, Effective Conservation Requires Clear Objectives and Prioritizing Actions, Not Places or Species. So in this, Brown is refuting Jenkins' perspective that conservation should only be based off of biodiversity. Brown suggests 4 principles of conservation planning to supplement Jenkins' perspective. The first of which is that priorities should clarify informed and explicit goals. The second is that conservation should prioritize and mandate action rather than specific species. The third is that economic, political, and social limitations of the area should be considered regarding how they will impact action. And the fourth and final is that complementarity should also be considered in order to protect all species rather than focus on threatened individuals in biodiverse areas. So Brown is proposing here that instead of just focusing on Jenkins' criteria, that we also look at the external limitations that may impact how successful conservation is. Jenkins then responds to Brown in an article defending his research, stating that Brown's perspective confuses the biological priorities for conservation with the obstacles we must overcome to protect them. So Jenkins believes that Brown's perspective on focusing on those limitations is something that is in accordance with the traditional perspective of conservation, whereas Jenkins thinks that we need to change our present behavior. He says that we intentionally avoid recommending specific conservation strategies with priority regions. So what he means here is rather than dictating what people should be doing in their specific regions, we say, hey, this is a priority. We need to defend this species and this ecosystem, but then let the local communities decide how to achieve that. He says that looking at those limitations is more of an excuse, and that we shouldn't be shying away from protecting specific threatened species because they might be more challenging. We need to be held responsible for our actions. An additional study outside of the Jenkins-Brown debate is an article from the year 2000, so a little bit before this debate, that looks at setting conservation priorities for land birds in the United States. And so this was done by a group called the Partners in Flight, otherwise known as PIF, and it's an early example of conservation guided by a numerical prioritization index. So this is done specifically on birds in North America, but it offers guidance on how numbers can be helpful and misleading in conservation efforts. And so for them, what they did is they looked at a variety of parameters such as breeding distribution, relative abundance, threats to breeding, and population trends within these birds. And from there, they created a index for the prioritization of conservation. This is an early example of what Jenkins' work is. They conclude their article stating that because species prioritization is a critical component of the conservation planning process, prioritization scores must reflect the best scientific information available. So numbers can be misleading in the sense that if they are not the most scientifically current, then we might be conserving the wrong areas. So this is a really effective method using this index. We just need to make sure that we are using the proper information, the proper data, and the proper technology. All of this information has helped guide, inform, and formulate a research question that I investigated for today. So my research aims at determining current domestic conservation areas based on GIS models and comparing them to Jenkins Priority Index in order to identify the conservation mismatch and localize priorities for biodiversity conservation. So we look to replicate Jenkins data and compare it to current conservation areas. So on this slide on the top right, you can see the GIS model that was used to make the three maps seen below. So the first map in the top left corner is our protected public lands. So these are lands that are protected, and we used a raster layer, a calculation, to centralize, create different centroids of these protected areas. The concentrated areas you can see below. And then from that, we localized them even more and took into consideration proximity to other protected areas in order to create the third map. Now, the third and largest map on the screen you can see has a variety of different shades of green. The darker the green is, the more preserved or protected the area is in respect to style of protection and its proximity to other protected areas. So on this slide, we have a video or a GIF that compares the map that I created using GIS data and maps to Jenkins Replicated Priority Index. So you can see the green represents areas that are currently protected as well as their proximity to other preserved areas, and then on the bottom in the black and white we see Jenkins Prioritization Index. The darker the area means it's a higher priority for conservation. So what we see here is that there is indeed a mismatch based off of this data. We have a lot of protected area in the west part of the United States. However, the areas that are very rich in biodiversity, such as the southeast part of the United States, is largely unprotected. And so this would be my recommendation for future research and conservation, is that we do look into some of these areas. We take into consideration Jenkins' perspective, and we need to look at other factors. So we can see that there is a mismatch based off of biodiversity, but I think it's important to acknowledge different factors that impact biodiversity. Um, One thing that could be looked into is the idea of geodiversity, and that is that different habitats support different species and different life forms. And so how can we protect areas that are geologically diverse that will then support a wide variety of species and biodiversity? I agree with Jenkins that we should try to overlook the social or economic or political limitations of conservation, because this should be a priority for nature's intrinsic value, and because in the long run it will improve human uh, the human lifestyle by protecting these different species. I do think that we need to further our research and make decisions based off of well-informed, thoughtful, and a holistic approach for conservation. Thank you.